and welcome to my channel In Search of Wonder. My name is Anne, and today I have thoughts. Recently, I finished reading Pamela by Samuel Richardson as part of the Jane Austen 250th birthday celebration that Charlene at Coffee and a Book and I are hosting all year long. Our first book of the year was Pamela or The Lost Memoirs of Jane Austen. Either one was an option. And I went with Pamela because I'd already read the previous book, and this one had been on my TBR for a really long time. It was also on my 50 by 50 list of books to read. And furthermore, it was epistolary, so it fit perfectly with the Epistolary January challenge that I'm hosting with several other wonderful booktubers. So, Pamela was an easy choice to make. I was dreading it, to be honest, but it ended up being actually a fascinating read, a very interesting read. I was engaged most of the way throughout the story. I don't know, I really engaged with it on a mental and emotional level, and I was so fascinated by it that I did a lot of digging and research into it, and so I have a lot of thoughts. It's really it's not very often that a book challenges me in this way, in an intellectual way, I guess. I have 5 pages of notes. I could write a dissertation on this thing. I mean, it might not be very, academic or whatever, but there's a lot here. So let's just get started. First of all, let me give you the plot, which is probably one of the most controversial aspects of this story. By the way, it is not possible for me to discuss this adequately without spoiling. So if you don't want to be spoiled, then please don't watch any further. But that's only if you plan on reading the book. I kind of feel like not everybody needs to read this book, even though I found it very fascinating and interesting. And if you are interested in the course of development of the English novel and the influence that certain books had on succeeding authors, you will want to read it. But if you're reading it for those reasons, you probably don't care whether you're spoiled or not. Anyway, it's up to you, continue or not. I sort of feel like I can tell you all about this book so that you don't have to read it yourself. On the other hand, you might find it just as interesting and engaging as I found it. So I don't know, it's up to you, but there definitely will be spoilers. I can tell you that much. So first of all, the plot. We have a 15-year-old girl whose name is Pamela, and she is a servant of a wealthy lady, a very wealthy woman. Now, servant is an interesting term. A lot of people refer to her as a maid. I don't know that that's really the best title for her, because she's called a lady in waiting in reference to her position. And that's not quite the same thing as a maid in my understanding. And the way that her employer treated her, she gave her an education, she raised her, almost seemed like it was more similar to a companion or training to be a companion, which kind of tracks with the lady in waiting. I'm sure that she did do some menial tasks for her employer, for her mistress, but she wasn't like a chambermaid or a scullery maid or something, or even like doing the house cleaning. I think she was a personal servant to her mistress. So I think it's important to keep that in mind through the context of the story. So anyway, her mistress dies, and her mistress's son inherits the estate, and so of course he becomes her new master. He is about 10 years older than her, and so he is 25, 26 years old, and he is basically a spoiled rich brat. Common problem in every era, right? And he sees a Pamela as a conquest. And, she's beautiful, and she's a servant. She's his property in some way, and so he feels like he has a right to take what he wants from her. But she does not see it that way, so she refuses his advances, which, by the way, are very clumsy, and yeah. So anyways, she refuses his advances. He is sometimes intrigued by this and sometimes incensed and enraged by the audacity of her to resist him, particularly since she does not mince words with him at all. And that is one of my favorite parts of this part of the story. So anyway, he keeps trying to get her And she keeps refusing, and it keeps intensifying until he tries to force himself on her. She's rescued by the fact that she faints because she's so, afraid of what he's trying to do. And then it intensifies even more. She says that she wants to go back to her parents because, she doesn't feel safe in this house. And by this point, he's just mad because he can't get what he wants. And so he's petulant with her, and he's basically like, fine, go to your parents. But he tricks her and has the coachman send her to his other estate. And so she goes by force to his other estate. And she languishes there a while. She gets embroiled with the local pastor there. She tries to enlist his aid in rescuing her. The housekeeper there, she calls the wretch, is an awful person, and basically keeps her under lock and key and watches her every move. And eventually Mr. B, who is her master, and that's the only name we're given for him, he comes and to his other estate, and again tricks her, deceives her, and tries to force himself on her. Again, she has a fit, a fainting fit. And at that point, it's so sudden and drastic that he thinks he's killed her. And so that starts the beginning of the change for him. And he begins to change his tactics. And instead of trying to force himself on her, he tries to woo her. Still, he doesn't have anything honorable in mind. He offers her eventually a proposal to be his mistress, and he gives her an official contract and everything. And again, she steadfastly refuses because she is a good girl and she has no interest in becoming anybody's mistress. All she wants is to go home to her parents. That's what she keeps saying over and over again. And so finally he says, okay, you can go home to your parents. But this time the difference is he really means it. By this time, we know that he has had a complete change of heart because he says, he gives her complete freedom. He says, you can go back to your parents. And so she does. And then he sends after her because he begins to miss her so excruciatingly. He has a complete and total change of heart in that he wants to marry her. So he sends after her. And again, this time, because he gives her complete freedom and he's not trying to force her into this relationship, he tells her, she could go on to her parents, no hard feelings, but if she comes back, then he will do the right thing by her. She comes back, and so then they get married, and then the last third of the book is about their upcoming nuptials and the plans for it and the preparations for it and different things like that. And then the actual wedding and some other interactions that take place that are really not essential to the plot, but kind of reinforce what Samuel Richardson, the point he's trying to make in this story. One, Mr. B's sister comes enraged because, first of all, she thinks that her brother has made this girl his mistress, and she just thinks that's not right for poor Pamela. But on the other hand, she doesn't want him to marry her because she is a servant. She's in the servant class. Even if she may be an upper servant, she's still a servant. She's not nobility, and so her very wealthy brother should not be marrying her. And so she comes after. There is an incredibly outrageous scene between her and Pamela and some other people. And then, anyway, everything gets resolved there. But during the course of that, Mr. B's sister, Lady Davers, reveals to Pamela some key pieces of information. One, that Mr. B had a lover before, some years before, before he reached his majority. And that he had been in a duel, and that he hadn't directly killed the man in the duel, but the man died later. He got sick and died, not too long after the duel. So this is all very interesting information for Pamela, but then at the very end of the story, she finds that not only did Mr. B have a relationship with this other woman, he had a child by her, and the child is living at a school not too far from where they live. So Pamela desires to adopt this child. And that's where we leave them. So really interesting story, right? Yeah, some very, very surprising twists and turns, to be sure. So let me just give you a rundown of the characters and some more information about them and what Samuel Richardson is doing with these characters. So first of all, we have Pamela, who is narrating the story through a series of letters to her parents. And she is a personification of virtue in this story. Richardson tells us that in many different ways, so that's undeniable. She is definitely representing virtue in this story. And most people look at the story because of the plot, and they say, and I have read people on all different sides saying this, most people, not everybody, but most people, that Pamela, the virtue in this story is boiled down to her chastity or her refusal to have sex outside of marriage, which is certainly the key point that the plot moves on. But Samuel Richardson goes through, he takes great pains to inform us that not only is she virtuous in that way, but she has many other virtues. She is generous. She desires to give whatever she does have to people who are circumstanced lesser than her, if that's an appropriate way to put that. And then she is not greedy. There are multiple opportunities here where she could be given access to money and riches beyond what she ever would have dreamed of otherwise, but she has no interest in money for money's sake. And she is obedient to her parents, and she's open and transparent and honest with them. In fact, honesty is another hallmark of her virtue. Everybody admires her honesty, including the most telling person, Mr. B. He, even as it relates to himself and what she says about him, that paints him in a very bad light, he admits that she's honest in that. And she is also very devout. She is very regularly praying, and she knows her Bible very well. She goes to church on a regular basis. There's a big element in the story where she's kept from going to church when she is imprisoned, and that is very hard on her, but then she is rejoicing very much when she is finally allowed to go to church. So she is all around a very virtuous person. She's definitely demonstrating all of those virtues. And additionally, she demonstrates a self-sacrificing love by her desire to take care of Mr. B's bastard daughter, which it's not compelled upon her. No one asks her to do it. She desires to, she offers to, and she wants to. So that's another aspect of her virtue. Another element of her character in the first 2/3 of the story that I really loved is her snappy wit. That was the best part of the book for me, was her comebacks to Mr. B, the things that she said to him when he was pursuing her, and he would say these ridiculous things to her, trying to gaslight her, trying to victim blame her, and all of this stuff, or trying to coerce her into doing what he wanted. And she was having none of it. And she saw right through everything that he said and did. And she had the best comebacks. She also has really witty observations about the people around her, and she describes them sometimes in the most cutting way, the people who are really, truly horrible. And it's fantastic. I love her witty commentary. And that's one thing that I did not like about the final third of the book, because she loses a lot of that. There are some sparks of it periodically, but she kind of just becomes this obsequious, subservient yes woman, for lack of a better term. And just, she loses all of that sense, that strong sense of wit and perspicacity. There's a word for you. So Mr. B is our other primary character. If she's the personification of virtue, he is the personification of vice. He also is representing someone who undergoes a conversion, if you will. He definitely has a redemptive arc. And that's the part that many people resist, because I think honestly the way that it's done in this story, but he definitely has a redemptive arc. There's no denying that. He is representative of a spoiled aristocrat who assumes that anything he wants can be his, whether he has to buy it or force it, or people just give it to him because of his position and power. And he doesn't understand when he's denied something, which is in part what intrigues him so much about Pamela. Virtue is not a virtue unless it's tested, right? So he is the one who is testing her virtue, and he tests it in two different ways. He tests it by threat of danger to her person, because he is the personification of evil that would harm her. He is trying to harm her physically in the act of taking what he wants from her. But then he switches gears, and then he tries to woo her and tempt her. And he senses, as well as the reader, that despite the fact that she is resisting him all along, the whole time she is attracted to him. It does a couple of things. It makes people skeptical of her motives in the story, but Samuel Richardson took great pains to tell us that she was very honest. The truth is, she was very interested in him. She was attracted to him. She may not have been in love with him from the beginning, but she was definitely attracted to him physically from the beginning of the story. But she is resistant to him. She is resistant to his threat of danger to her person, and she is resistant to his threat of charming her and tempting her into do something that she knows is wrong. So she is virtuous because she resists both of those avenues of attack, and she maintains her personal integrity in spite of what he does to try to take it away from her. There are a few more characters I want to mention. One is the two housekeepers. So the story takes place in two different estates that belong to Mr. B. And in the first one where the story opens, we have Mrs. Jervis, who is kind of like a kindly mother figure to Pamela. And then she is taken to his other estate where Mrs. Jukes, she calls the wretch. And Mrs. Jukes is someone who is ugly as all get out, and so that's an indication to you that she's not a good person, because a lot of times that trope was used in, or that type, whatever, however you want to put it, was used in literature. You know, an ugly person was a bad person. She was an ugly person. She was mean. She was nasty, and she did whatever Mr. B told her to do, whether it was right or wrong. Whatever he told her to do was right. That was the extent of her morality. Whereas Mrs. Jervis had a higher standard of morality, a more biblical standard of morality, if you will, and she had no intention of doing things that Mr. B wanted her to do if they were wrong. So she obviously is the more righteous of the two. There was a direct contrast drawn between Mrs. Jervis and Mrs. Jukes, and Mrs. Jervis definitely wins in the contest, and because of her standing up for what is right, Mrs. Jervis ends up losing her position, but then in the end, she regains it. Then we have another character, Mr. Williams, who kind of is a bit of a foil, I guess, in a sense, for Mr. B. This is the whole ridiculous aspect of the story, is that here is Mr. B chasing after what he can't have, and then he is accusing Pamela and Mr. Williams, the local pastor at his second estate, of doing the same thing. Yeah. So he is accusing them, essentially of committing adultery in a sense, like not in those words, but like basically he's telling Mr. Williams, you're trying to take her away from me. Well, dude, she wasn't yours in the first place, okay? When all this was going down, she was not yours. Mr. B never quite got that. Never quite sunk that into his skull, that Pamela was not his. He was always extremely jealous of Mr. Williams, but the truth is, Pamela has zero feelings for Mr. Williams. As we know, she was interested in Mr. B all this time. She really just wanted to go home to her parents. That's all she wanted to do. And she saw Mr. Williams as someone who could help her with that. There was a possibility raised that he could marry her as a means of removing her from Mr. B's clutches. But she resisted that because she didn't really want to marry him or anybody. She wanted to go back to her parents. So that never actually happened. But the fact that the idea was raised made Mr. B extremely jealous, whatever. So then we have a couple of other players who are mostly off page in the story. Pamela's parents that she's writing to, they write a couple letters back to her. We see her father briefly towards the end of the story. All we know is that they raised her to be a good girl, and they are down on their luck. They originally were better off than they are now. Maybe not members of the noble class, but better off than they were at this point in the story, that there were some debts that their older children had incurred that they were responsible for, and they were having trouble paying them. So now her parents had to work in order to earn their keep, as did Pamela. And then we have Pamela's first employer and Mr. B's mother, as I told you, who is a very wealthy woman who gave Pamela a position, and in that position she gave her some education and some training, but at the same time she completely failed to raise her own children properly. So then we have Mr. B's other servants. Besides Mrs. Jervis, there were several others in his original estate who tried to help Pamela. They were all, they wanted to get her out of Mr. B's clutches. They did not approve of how Mr. B was handling the situation, how he was treating Pamela. And so they stood up for her, and they all lost their jobs. But spoiler, by the end of the story, they get their jobs back again. And then we have Mr. B's neighbors who validate Pamela's entrance into society, and they offer commentary on the story and characters. Really most of the scenes with Pamela's, with Mr. B's neighbors are so cringy, so cringy. The book could totally, it would 100% be better without them. And so much happens that should be private happens in front of the neighbors that you just have all kinds of secondhand embarrassment in those scenes, and I really could have done without those. And those neighbors didn't need to be there. They didn't need to be part of this story. But they do validate Pamela's eventual entrance into society. That's basically the function that they serve. If they serve a better function or a deeper function or a more symbolic function, I don't know what it is. And then additionally, there is Lady Davers, who is Mr. B's sister, who, as I said, does not approve of him either marrying her or having her as his mistress. She had offered to take Pamela as her servant into her house, but Mr. B wasn't having none of that. So she is mentioned very often during the course of the story, but we only see her towards the end. When it comes to a classic novel, I think that, especially one as old as this, is almost 300 years old. That's pretty old. When you're this far removed from the cultural norms and the influences that it came out of, it's really helpful to get a little background on that. So I did a decent amount of digging. Well, some of it I already knew before I read the book, but questions were raised in my mind as I was reading, so I did a lot of digging. Most of this information I didn't just know, like I learned it as I was reading up about this book and reading articles about the culture out of which Pamela was written. And I found it so fascinating, so I just want to share it with you, what I learned. So first of all, it was written in 1740, which was smack dab in the middle of the Age of Enlightenment. And there was a lot going on in terms of politics and philosophy and religion in that era. So much. There was so much thinking happening, and reason over faith was being raised as the highest good, if you will, if I could put it in that way. You can see the influence of the Enlightenment in the story. First of all, you have a servant girl as the female main character, as the heroine, no less, of this story. So that is remarkable. Someone made a comment, and I'm not sure, like I haven't looked up all of the, all of the novels, the classic novels, the great novels since then. Someone made the claim that it is really the only classic novel of standing where a servant girl is the heroine of the story. So, I mean, I honestly, none come to mind. But if so, I mean, that was shockingly forward for its time, even for the Age of Enlightenment. She's raised to the level of her noble husband by the end of the story. That definitely was revolutionary in that time, but it was a revolutionary thought. Revolutionary literally, because that kind of idea is what led to, for example, the French Revolution, and to a lesser extent it was involved in the American Revolution as well. So you can definitely see the influence of that revolutionary idea that was gaining strength at that time in Europe. And her worth is intrinsic value as a human, and her worth is unrelated to her social or economical status, which was, again, a revolutionary idea. One quote from the book, she says, "But oh, sir, my soul is of equal importance with the soul of a princess, though my quality is inferior to that of the meanest slave." And one other thing is, obviously, the topic of virtue was a huge topic for this story, like as a whole point. And that was a big idea that was being discussed in many facets of it in the Age of Enlightenment and the Age of Reason. A lot of writers and authors were writing about this concept. Samuel Richardson was certainly not writing out of a vacuum here. Then we have the Great Awakening, which was happening concurrently at this time. And those two movements kind of like were hand in hand, not always with each other, but not always against each other either, as you might think. So he's also writing from that background as well. In his role as a printer/publisher, Samuel Richardson had printed works by George Whitefield and John Wesley, who were key players in the Methodist movement at that time and the burgeoning evangelical movement in the church. And so he was obviously very familiar with evangelical thought, and he, by all accounts, seems to have been at least in agreement with much of it. And he was very involved in that movement to one extent or another. And so some aspects of that you can see influence of in this story about Pamela, actually the fingerprints are all over the place. First of all, inward piety, so in the evangelical movement, inward piety finds its expression in outward virtuous living, it's kind of the best way that I can think of to describe what they meant. So that's kind of my summary of the thought. It probably goes a lot deeper than that. Well, I'm sure it does. It goes a lot deeper than that, and there's more facets to it, and it might be more nuanced, but that's what I would boil it down to. The Methodist movement, which was sometimes called the holiness movement, like the inward piety was expressed outwardly through virtuous living, and works always follow faith, which is a doctrine that is espoused in the book of James quite clearly. So the Methodists were very intentional about shoring up their faith and expressing it through good works. And additionally, the whole concept of evangelicalism is sharing the truth of the gospel with other people and leading other people to conversion, gathering more people to the church, gathering more people to believe. And so I think one thing that often gets overlooked in discussions of this book is the conversion of Mr. B. I hadn't heard anybody talk about it until I came across it in the actual story, and I was blown away by it. Now, there's not a point where Mr. B bows his head and says the sinner's prayer, like, would be a typical hallmark of evangelical movement of, more recent times. But he does have a very telling conversation with Mr. Williams. And it says, "Poor Mr. Williams, with tears of joy in his eyes, said to Mr. B, 'How happily, sir, have you been touched by the divine grace, before you have been hurried into the commission of sins,'" in other words, that he didn't actually have sex with Pamela, "'that the deepest penitence could hardly have atoned for.'" So he didn't, now I do think that God can forgive anything, but he didn't actually rape her, so he was saved from committing that sin. "God has enabled you to stop short of the evil of raping her, and you have nothing to do but to rejoice in the good, which now will be doubly so because you can receive it without the least inward reproach. You do well," said he, "to remind me," and this is Mr. B talking, "that I owe all this to the grace of God. I bless him for it, and I thank this good man for his excellent lessons," Pamela's father. "I thank his dear daughter for following them, and I hope from her good example and your friendship, Mr. Williams, in time to be half as good as my tutoress." So he wants to grow in his faith. So then it goes on from there. But that, to me, in conjunction with the fact that later on, Pamela says, when they go to get married, she's like, "Well, I want to get married in a church." And so he says, "Well, we have a chapel here, but it's been used for lumber storage for generations." So basically for generations, his family has rejected faith. He said, "But, we'll clean it up and we will use it as a chapel." And so that's a more symbolic indication of his conversion. So I think that's one thing that a lot of people overlook in this story, especially I can understand, like, if you're not a Christian or a believer, it wouldn't make sense to you, but the gospel doesn't make sense, really, honestly, to anybody but someone who has experienced it and experienced its change in their life and what it does for a person. So to me, I personally thought that that was really beautiful. It was clumsy. Samuel, it was so clumsy, but I could see what he was doing and I could appreciate that. So again, that is evidence of the Methodist impact on the story that Samuel Richardson was writing. And additionally, I just wanted to point out, this is something that I learned that I found very interesting, that even the development of the novel itself is owing, at least in large part, to the Methodist movement, because the Methodists purposely used print media to advance their cause. Like, it was an intentional act on their part to utilize the printed word, not just pamphlets and essays, but the arts, literature, poetry, and novels, stories, to advance the cause of Methodism. And so Pamela was all a part of that. Another thing that you have to understand is that, again, the novel is developing here. It's not a defined art by this point. It's still becoming. And so some people say it's the first novel. People disagree on that. I don't know enough about how you would specifically define an actual novel to to agree or say which novel I think was the first English novel, but this is definitely a step in the direction. And it either directly or indirectly influenced every novel that came after it. So it's a key player, 100%, absolutely a key player in the development. And the epistolary development kind of went hand in hand, was one of the initial stages in the development of the novel. Or maybe not initial, but it helped propel the novel forward in a couple of ways. A commenter on my channel mentioned that epistolary novels paved the way for chapter divisions, which was, a later development in the novel. And it also allowed for an instant relay of the narration rather than looking back on the past, something that happened before. In the letter writing you're writing, Pamela is writing about something that just happened. It's an in-the-moment narration, which was kind of new at the time. And it also allowed for more introspection into the character's thoughts and motivations, which is a huge part of being a novel. I have a quote from an article that I found online. The author didn't put their name to it, but they said, "This was the first artistically serious epistolary novel, prototypical for the Europe-wide epistolary novel boom in the 18th century." And the same person also said, "This book was the first detailed depiction of the emotional and intellectual inner life of a novel character." So for all of those reasons, it was important in the development of the English novel. And there was a huge, extraordinary response to this novel, which is always the question that I have when I read a novel from that time, particularly one that really engages me. I think, how did people in that day respond to this novel? What did they think of it? And it was, by all accounts, everyone agrees, it was the first international bestseller. So it made a huge splash. I mean, think about in our modern terms, it was a huge bestseller. Someone on Goodreads referred to it as the twilight of its era. So that's how you have to think of it. There was merchandise, there were follow-up stories, people wrote sequels, people rewrote the story, there were operas on it, there were plays about it, there was merchandise, there were wax figurines made of the characters, there were souvenirs, whatever. Like, it was a huge explosion because people loved it. They loved Pamela. But of course, there were detractors and critics as well. And Henry Fielding was one of them. He's famous for having written Shyamala, which I just started reading and do want to finish reading. And I'm interested in his perspective on it. And there were detractors. But a lot of them, like Henry Fielding in particular, he took issue with the religious elements of the story. That was his big beef with the story. It wasn't with the plot or the characters or anything. He was attacking the religious foundations that Samuel Richardson was coming from. Hello, interjecting editing in here because there was a section here where I was trying to explain something and I just felt like I didn't explain myself very well and I felt like it was easy to take it the wrong way. So I just wanted to refilm that part and hopefully this version is better than what I previously recorded. So this section was about how I approached reading the book because I had some questions based on what I already knew of the book and this story and the reviews and analysis I'd already read of it. And my question was, was Pamela a reliable narrator? And two, very closely related to that, was she really manipulating Mr. B into marriage, or is it just that she truly was being virtuous? So whenever I am reading a classic book, I have learned over the past years by listening to people who know a lot more than I've learned a few key rules, I guess, for correctly reading a novel and understanding what it's trying to say. And one of the things that I tried to keep in mind was the historical context that the book was written in, and I've already talked about that at length. And the other thing is kind of like what you do when you're studying the Bible. It's really the same concept, honestly. You're wanting to understand what the book is telling you, so you have to compare it with itself and against itself. I try to compare one aspect of what I'm reading with other aspects from the same book, but against itself, not against what I think about it or what my thoughts or feelings or responses are to it, but what the book is saying about itself, what the characters are saying about each other, what the characters are saying about the narrative, like what you know, what is Pamela saying about this that happened? And what is Mr. B saying about this that happened? And do they match up? And where do they disagree, etc.? That kind of thing, like comparing it against itself to identify what's really happening. So I really tried hard to do that. In fact, I was keeping a list in the back of the book of places where Pamela's narrative was corroborated by a third party to the situation, or by what Samuel Richardson himself was saying, because there are a couple of places where he pops in with a third person narrative. I learned that there are a couple of different ways you can approach interpreting the meaning and purpose of a classic work. And a lot of times the two are sort of overlapping and impossible to separate. That one is what you as a reader are bringing in your understanding of the story, and the other is what the author was genuinely trying to say. Sometimes you don't really have any idea what the author really was trying to say because they're not making it clear. They may not make it clear in the story itself. They may leave it ambiguous. And a lot of times authors don't really write analyses of their own work. They do leave it to the reader to bring their own conclusions, to bring their own worldview, to bring their own perspective, their own bias, etc., and interpret the story as they will. But there are times when an author is very plain about the story that they wrote and what they want the reader to see in it. And so my thought is, if an author is making it clear what they were trying to say, then we as a reader should respect that and read it with that in mind. So that's always how I approach a novel, especially one if I'm not really understanding it or not really getting exactly what the author's trying to say. I try to see if there's anything they wrote about their book that would shed light on it to help me understand it from their perspective, since they're the one who wrote it. So all that to say, based on those factors, the cultural and historical context that the book was written in, and the clues within the text itself, comparing the text to itself, and what Samuel Richardson himself said in many different places about the novel, because of those factors, I came to the conclusion, and I felt like it was a pretty firm conclusion, that he intended Pamela's narrative to be pretty straightforward and for us to take it at face value, and that she is supposed to be seen as a reliable narrator, even though readers in his day and in our day can find flaws, not in the veracity of the narration, but in the believability of it, I guess, that, you know, a person would be able to have that perspective and that consistent virtue throughout a story. So anyway, my conclusion was that Pamela was indeed a reliable narrator. And so the more I read in the story, the more I read about what Richardson said about the story, and the more I understood the context in which he was writing it, I became more and more convinced that I should just take the story straightforward. And so from that, I believe that Richardson had a few important things that he was trying to say in this story. And given that same framework, I feel like Richardson, what he was trying to do is pretty clear, and it's pretty obvious, the story he was trying to tell and the meaning he was giving to this story and the meaning behind the story. To me, it's pretty clear. And so the rest of this clip is basically talking about what Richardson was trying to say based on the framework from which I was trying to read it. So back to me in the car.
Richardson himself stated many times, in many ways, that the point of his book was to demonstrate that a virtuous life would be rewarded. Now, you can take issue with that statement, and I would, and many people do, but that was his point. That was his point in the story. Her rewards for her virtue are spiritual, because one, she doesn't go against her own conscience, but two, she is able to win Mr. B over to her faith as well, and his character is transformed. Her rewards are physical, because her chastity is maintained and her person is not unharmed completely, because there are things that happen in the story because of what Mr. B has done to her. So she does experience some danger, but ultimately she is safe in her person. And then material, her rewards are material because she becomes very wealthy and she gains status. So she has socioeconomic advantages as well. And he's also purposely portraying in Mr. B the potential for a vile and evil man to be redeemed and the importance of a Christian's testimony bringing about that conversion and redemption. So I'm reading this because it's a little bit easier for me to say what I'm saying. And I already told you about that conversation that he had with Mr. Williams. I feel like it's pretty clear that Richardson is trying to show that it's possible for even the worst person to be redeemed by the blood of Christ. I also think he didn't necessarily say this himself, but to me it's obvious by the way the story goes that he's shining a light on the habits and attitudes of the time that he considered immoral, which are immoral by our standards even today, that noble men were not looked down upon at all for seeing their servant girls as opportunities, handy opportunities, and that they didn't see anything immoral about just using them for their sexual gratification, which obviously in our day, we look at that with horror, but they didn't at that time. And so Richardson was painting it in the worst possible light so that people would pay attention and say, oh, that's what that looks like. You. Okay. Which may be in part reason why today we look at it and we go, ew, those guys were gross. Although, to be honest, I know the situation continues in some places and circles, but at least there's collectively, socially, the understanding that it shouldn't happen. And Richardson is adhering to a biblical standard of virtue that is unchanged by social status, economic status, or any other man-made system. His standard of virtue in this story is not based on a person's social economic status or their wealth or their position. It's whether it's right or whether it's wrong. And what is right is regardless of gender either. Like what is right for the man is right for the woman and vice versa, for the servant or the master or for the pastor and the neighbors down the street. And then finally, he is creating an idealistic vision of the nobility living a virtuous life. This is the latter third of the book. And I think that's his purpose there, to show what it would look like for a noble family to regain the virtue they had lost or to live a virtuous life, as illustrated by Pamela and Mr. B in their married life. And I don't 100% agree with his image that he's painting there, but it's very consistent with the time in which he lived. I really need to go, so I will record the rest of this later. The rest of what I want to talk about is really my own personal response to Pamela, what I liked and what I didn't like, and my thoughts about the influence that Richardson had on later novels, in particular, Jane Austen. So I will take some time later to film another clip, maybe tomorrow, and share with you the rest of my thoughts. So for now, I'm going to pause this and we'll be back later. To finish up, these are my thoughts about the book, my personal response to it, aside from, this is more my subjective, I guess, reaction to the book. I felt like, although I could see and appreciate what Samuel Richardson was attempting to do in this novel, I do see a lot of flaws to my mind. The biggest one, and this is what I think throws a lot of people off of the book and makes them strongly dislike it, and that is that Pamela is the voice of the narration and she is telling her own story. But since the primary point of the story is that she is virtuous and good, she is constantly telling you as the reader that she is virtuous and good. And in her own voice, she's constantly extolling her own virtue. And whenever anyone does that, we automatically assume that they're lying, because if they were truly virtuous and good, then they would also be humble and they wouldn't feel a need to extol their own virtue. So immediately, I mean, if you think about it, if someone is bragging to you about how good they are at something, or whatever it is, you immediately begin to suspect that it's not true because they feel the need to brag about it. And I think that's the dynamic that gets set up here from the beginning in the way that Richardson decided to construct this story. Because Pamela is the voice controlling the narration, but someone has to inform us that she is virtuous and it's left to her. There was a similar dynamic in a much more simple book that I read recently called Positively Penelope. And one of the things that I disliked about that one as well was a similar thing. The character felt the need to defend and justify her own personality to other people around her. Now, this was the voice of the author speaking her thoughts and sharing her point, but she put it in the dialogue of her main character. So her main character was extolling her own virtue. And I'm automatically suspicious, right? And I think that that's one of the biggest flaws here. We automatically begin to suspect Pamela because she's constantly telling us that she's very good. Another big issue is in the plot, because I see what Richardson is doing here and appreciate it. I think I love a good, strong, redemptive arc, but the way he set this up, there's just this 2/3 of the story. Pamela is trying to escape this guy who is like the scum of the earth and is intent on just taking and harming her. And then all of a sudden he has a change of heart and she capitulates and falls in love with him immediately. And then they're getting married. There's not any character development really. It's just like a switch is flipped. It's like an immediate difference. And then the tone of the story changes completely from that point. And so just the way that it's set up, it's completely unrealistic. It's even laughable. And it's very difficult for the modern reader to take that at face value and think that that's actually what Samuel Richardson was trying to portray. And yes, it was. But I think that, again, the way that he constructed it, without giving time for the character development, in order for such a situation to actually happen in real life, a decent amount of time, considerable amount of time, needs to go by. Trust needs to be proven in a variety of ways. It didn't happen in this story, the way that Samuel Richardson told it. And this, you can't really blame Samuel Richardson for, in my opinion, because I think it's a product of its era and the novel was still in development. But I found it very interesting. I read a quote that one of the things Jane Austen loved about Samuel Richardson, and I'll get more to that in a minute, was his characterization was so good and that he was so consistent with his characters. And I was like, really? Because I feel like Austen is the queen of characterization. I feel like she mastered that art. And Richardson, I don't think so. No. So I think, yeah, his characters, like everything they do is overblown and exaggerated, and they're very one-dimensional characters. They're each trying to portray one thing, and that's all there is to them. Now, it was more realistic, I guess, and more human-like than what came previously, but it's not fully there yet. The other big issue that you might want to take with his story is his very premise that virtue is rewarded. Now, I think he was just, I don't think he was trying to cite that virtue is always rewarded materially with material things. I don't think he was trying to advocate some early prototype of prosperity gospel or something like that. I think he was just trying to encourage young people to virtue with a moralistic tale or a fable where virtue is rewarded. And it's not unusual. It's not a strange idea out of nowhere. This is a common idea in stories and fables and fairy tales and moral instruction. It's not uncommon, but I think a lot of people take issue with it as being the primary theme of this novel and the way that it happens. And that combined with all of the other stuff that goes on in the story, it does. You could take it the wrong way. Personally, the things that I did not like about this story is how everything was exaggerated. Everything felt like a caricature and overblown. The characters were overblown. Their actions and their reactions were excessive, were extreme. Mr. B was so evil and Pamela was so good. There was no, each one was like to the opposite extreme. And then when their relationship dynamic shifts, then all of a sudden Pamela goes from being snarky and, if you want to use the word rebellious, I don't think it's quite the right word, but you know what I mean, to then suddenly being subservient and obsequious and flattering and gushing to an extreme. Too much. The situations, the emotions, the dialogue, the scene between Pamela and her new sister-in-law is just portrays an excess of emotion that is just beyond the pale. Too much. There are other things that other people also complain about in this book. One is the repetitive nature of the writing. Pamela repeats herself a lot of times, the things that she's saying, especially in the latter third of the book. But the scenes and the scenarios are also repeated. Like, I think Mr. B hides in a closet like 3 different times. And it could be made a lot tighter with a lot less repetition. Again, as is the case with a lot of older novels, some good editing would not be amiss here. And I've kind of touched on this, but I did not like the portrayal of the marriage relationship because Richardson was portraying it as ideal. And it was not. That was not. I don't know anybody who wants to be in a marriage relationship like that. And the fact that it was considered an ideal marriage at that time, at least by Richardson, and I'm guessing by a lot of people because they loved the book. No, I'm not signing up for that. And of course, there's the whole plot where a girl willingly marries her would-be rapist. Yeah, I'm not a big fan of that storyline. Let's talk about what I did like, because we want to leave this on a positive note. There were some things I really enjoyed. It wasn't a total fail for me. Like I said, I was very invested in reading this book. I spent a lot of time researching it and looking into it and thinking about it and mulling over it, discussing it with people, finding as much information and analysis about it as I could. So that counts for something. I was very involved in this book. So there's that. The other thing is, I really loved Pamela's wit in the beginning of the book, the first 2/3 of the book. Her comebacks to Mr. B were just the best. They made me laugh, they made me chuckle, and they made me cheer her on and be like, you go girl, you tell him, you put that man in his place, kind of thing, because he needed to be put in his place. And she was like just the person to do it. All of that was great. I really enjoyed that. And that's one of the things I really hated about the latter third of the book, is that they completely changed and she wasn't like that at all anymore. I also, overall, what Richardson was trying to say, I appreciated. Not necessarily if you look at it as him trying to say virtue will always be rewarded, I wouldn't agree with that. Virtue is its own reward, I would say. And I think that he improved on that messaging in later books based on what I've heard. And I think in some ways he seems to have acknowledged that. But at the same time, I really did appreciate the idea behind the redemptive arc and the portrayal of a godly, devout, or if you want to use the word from that time, pious person like Pamela, and as it played out in her life. It was very idealized, exaggerated, overblown, like I was saying. So the portrayal of it wasn't fantastic, but I liked the idea of what Richardson was trying to portray. I enjoyed the epistolary format. In particular, I loved how the letters become basically a character in this story. They become part and parcel of the plot. So the fact that she is writing the letters is completely unbelievable, but that plays into the narration of the story. It becomes an issue of like almost a joking matter between her and Mr. B, as well as a point of contention. And it becomes a turning point in the relationship. When Mr. B reads her letters that she's written to her mom, that's one thing that is a key piece on his developing a change of heart. Those are things that I did enjoy about it. So it wasn't a total fail. I'm so glad that I read it. I didn't rate it very highly because I don't think it's a great book, but at the same time, it makes people think, it makes people talk. There were things about it that I really did enjoy. There are parts of me that would say 5 stars. There's parts of me that would say 1 star. So I split the difference and put it at 2.5 stars. But honestly, I feel like this book is one that will stick with me. It might be worth, in that sense, 5 stars. I'll be thinking about it for a long time. The final thing I want to talk about is to circle back to the whole idea as to why we included this book in our celebration of the birth of Jane Austen. According to Austen's nephew, I think, Samuel Richardson was her favorite author. He wrote 3 epistolary novels, and she apparently loved all of them. I've heard differing reports. Some people say that she said Clarissa was her favorite. Some people say that she said Sir Charles Grandison was her favorite. Regardless, he was her favorite author, and she was very familiar with his works. Her nephew, James Edward Austen Lee, apparently said, "Her knowledge of Samuel Richardson was such as no one is likely again to acquire. Every circumstance narrated in Sir Charles Grandison, all that was said or done in the Cedar Parlor was familiar to her, and the wedding days of characters like Lady L and Lady G were as well remembered as if they had been living friends." And that was from an article on Austen Prose, and I will try to remember to link to that article in the description box below, because, and also the other articles that I've quoted, because that was a really informative article about Austen and her relationship with Samuel Richardson and his books. So she loved Richardson. She apparently in particular admired his characterization, which I don't understand because she was way better than that dude. But the biggest thing is that as I was reading this, and I didn't know before I started it, and I've since discovered that other people have observed the same thing. So it's not just me imagining things and seeing Austen in every corner. There are definite hints of Pride and Prejudice in Pamela. And I like to think that Pride and Prejudice is Austen's response to Pamela. Almost like she was saying, "I see what you're doing there, Sammy, but I'm gonna do it better." And she did. Totally did. Jane Austen did it better. Let me just briefly go over, let me briefly go over the things that caught my eye that just made me think Pride and Prejudice. First of all, another article I'm gonna quote for it summed it up very nicely, so I'm gonna read this so I don't waste time me trying to formulate my thoughts. "The two heroes between these two books have similar character arcs. Each is put off the idea of matrimonial bonds with the heroine by her lower social status, but are eventually persuaded that the heroine's virtues outweigh her low connection. Both men initially assume their attentions will be welcomed and are therefore angry when they are rejected, but their reactions are entirely different. Because whereas Mr. B is a bad guy, Mr. Darcy is a gentleman, a thorough and complete gentleman. And when Lizzie refuses him, he is angry and he is surprised. He was not expecting that response, but he leaves. He gives her a letter, but he tells her he's not going to trouble her anymore. And he keeps that promise. And it's not until she comes back into his life and shows signs of having had a change of heart that he begins to hope. And he tells her that he begins to hope that there could possibly be a future. And then he moves very tentatively. In fact, for me, every time I read the book, I'm like, come on, Darcy, because you know by this point that Lizzie is thoroughly emotionally invested now, and she is rapidly falling in love with Mr. Darcy. And she's like, why won't he say something? But he is taking his time. He's not going to make the same mistake twice, because he knows when he proposes to her the second time, he's like, one word from you will silence me on this subject forever. He knows this is the last time. He's not going to keep pestering her and bothering her, but he thinks there might be a possibility that she's interested. So he tries one more time, tentatively. And the rest, as they say, is history. It's the biggest difference between Mr. B and Mr. Darcy. So Austen kind of took the storyline, changed up significantly, no doubt, but the bare bones of it are there. And it's so much better. She says a lot of the same things in this story. She's preaching the same message or similar messages, but it's just so much better. It's so much more pleasant to read. It's so much more believable. The characters are so much more human. I love it. A couple of other things that I noticed was Lizzie has Pamela's witty nature, and that's one of the things that Mr. B loves about Pamela. Well, first of all, he's intrigued by the fact that she's rejecting him, most emphatically. But beyond that, he is impressed by her wit, and he enjoys their interactions with her witty comebacks and the insults that she flings at him. He thrives on the interaction, which is very similar to Lizzie and Darcy. There are also some similarities in some of the other characters. Like Jane is very similar to Pamela in that kind of one-dimensional, extremely good sort of way. Jane is a very angelic sort of character with very little flaw in her. But then Lydia is like an anti-Pamela. So it's like, instead of combining the story between two characters and making a completely unrealistic, Jane Austen took the story and spread it out between different people, the characteristics of some of the things and some of the things that happened, and put them in different characters so that it's much more believable, because it didn't all happen to the same two people. It's spread out. I feel like I'm not explaining that very well, but it makes sense in my head. But Lydia is like the anti-Pamela, like the opposite of Pamela. She is not virtuous, and she doesn't care about virtue or goodness or any of these things. She's just in it for a good time. She doesn't care about anything else. She does not resist Mr. B, or in her case, Mr. Wickham. Wickham also, again, like Mr. B is spread out between Darcy and Wickham. So Mr. Wickham is all of the bad parts of Mr. B and none of the goodness. And Mr. Darcy is good to start with, but he grows and he improves based on Lizzie's influence and the things that she says that make him think, and he grows. Also, both Mr. B and Mr. Darcy express to their respective female counterparts that they were raised to have, good manners and to be able to function well in society, but they weren't given. Mr. Darcy says he was left in pride to live his life. And Mr. B says essentially the same thing. He was spoiled. He says repeatedly that he was spoiled and never told no, and so he wasn't able to regulate himself as he became an adult. He always just took what he wanted. So it's interesting they both have that perspective on their raising. Also, Lady Catherine de Bourgh bears a strong resemblance to Lady Davers in the Pamela story, because she is the snobby relative who has no desire to see her nephew, sister in Pamela's case, marry this good-for-nothing upstart, and bringing that bad blood into the family. So there's a very similar scene, but again, Austen did it better. So in my opinion, Jane Austen's novel, Pride and Prejudice, is much more complex than Pamela. It's much more, in terms of plot, in terms of characters, in terms of setting, social situations, everything, much more complex, more realistic in every single way, more subtle. She makes her points much more subtly, and ultimately much more satisfying. That is my very lengthy discourse on the subject of Pamela by Samuel Richardson. I hope that you enjoyed this conversation about it. Kind of monologue, actually, I guess, but please contribute to the conversation in the comments. Let me know what you think about Pamela. Have you read it? What are your thoughts? Do you agree or disagree with me? What is your take on Pamela's narration in the story if you've read it? If you haven't read it, does my discussion make you want to read it? Or are you done? You're just gonna let this one slide off into eternity past without any notice by you? Let me know in the comments, and I will see you next time. Bye.